well, my wife has promptly exited the sanctuary. But I was going to mention, I mentioned once or twice in here about her great passion for plants. She loves plants. And the stories I've shared before, they haven't always been favorable. It's whether it's talking about a garden graveyard or plants failing to live in our home. We've had many stories about plants in our house, but this isn't one of those times. In fact, this story has to do with one of her great successes with plants. When we moved to our new house, obviously not this past December, but the December before that, Caitlin was bringing these plants, and one of the plants that she brought was one of these vine plants. And so when we got to the house, we had to figure out where are all these plants going to go. Well, this vine plant is in a planter about this big, and it has a leather strap, and it's a hanging planter. And so we decided we're going to hang this vine plant over our kitchen sink where we have a little kitchen window right there. So we hung it up right there, and it gets some decent sun, and it already had a bit of a vine, so I put up a couple screws over top of the window frame so that way we could line the vine over and it have a place to grow and to go. Well, as I already mentioned, this isn't a story of a dying plant. Rather, this one has continued to grow and to grow and to grow. I don't know, maybe vines are just easy. Don't tell her I said that. But this thing just keeps growing and growing to the point where she's actually taken pieces of it and cut it off, and she's put it into the water to start a new vine. What's amazing about this plant is the fact that it is able to grow roots from the stem when it's placed into water. So it's this propagation by cutting. Now, plants are able to do so many amazing things. When you think of creation, there's so many amazing things, but plants themselves, they do amazing things. This also can also be seen in the process of grafting plants together. This is where two plants are brought together at a point of a cut on each plant, and they are secured together, and the healthy tissue begins to grow together and bind them as one. It's interesting. It's really unique. It's an amazing thing. We can't do that. Can't cut my arm off and cut Dave's arm off and put our arms together and we become one. Right? So this is very unique. This is an amazing thing. These plants grow together, and now they both draw the same nutrients from the same root. Now, the process of grafting is an intentional process. As I read up a little bit on this process, there's a lot of particulars. You have to make sure they are lined up together. You can't just have the bark touching, but the insides have to touch as well for that tissue to come together. And so it's a very intentional process. When analyzed on a large scale, the intentionality of the one who is conducting the process is of great importance. Again, they have to pay close attention. They have to pay close attention to the details. You see, the individual might see the flowers and fruit of a tree to be beautiful and worth preserving, all the while it has a poor root system. So they want to save what's been cultivated, the beautiful fruit and flowers. On the other hand, another tree may have small and sour fruit, but it has a robust and significantly stronger root system. By grafting the top of the first plant with the bottom of the second plant, the individual has now strengthened both plants, taken the best elements of both and brought them together to make one strong, beautiful tree. In the text this morning, it's interesting, the Apostle Paul is going to use the same type of imagery. This is because the idea of grafting things together wasn't foreign to their culture. Right? We'll even see he talks about olive shoots and olive trees, and it would have been particular to their culture, their geographical experience. And so the idea of grafting was even known in his time. So he's going to utilize this imagery in our text today. But unlike the example that I just gave of one of these trees having something good to bring and another to have something good to bring, that serves as the reason to bring these plants together. What we're going to see is that really there's only one contributing piece in this equation of any significance, and that is the root of this plant. We're going to see that was actually being grafted in from a surface level when you look at it, isn't of really much value when it appears dead and laying on the ground. In the previous weeks, Paul has greatly emphasized the failures of Israel. Again, we've spent this journey going through the book of Romans in which Paul draws out the conclusion that mankind wholesale has rejected God. But even more so, we see that Israel, they have received the special revelation of God, something uniquely beautiful. God has come to them and he's revealed himself to them, and they rejected him. They denied this only sustenance that can provide, ultimately seen in their rejection of Jesus Christ. Paul has shown that they placed their faith in a misguided place, and the rejection, we saw last week, the rejection of Jesus Christ left them in legitimate danger. Remember, we studied that word soteria, which is the short root of soteriology, the idea of understanding salvation. And so when we saw that word, we saw that the word fully means to be saved, to be delivered, to be removed from harm and grave danger. And so we saw that ultimately this is where Israel's rejection and denial has left them. Now, on the other hand, as Paul's gone through this letter, he's also emphasized that there are those that have been far from God have now received God. He speaks of the Gentiles and say that they have received him, but they weren't looking for him. In fact, again, because we know from what Paul has said thus far that those who live in accordance to the flesh live for the flesh. They don't desire God, they don't want to honor God, they don't want to please God, they're not looking for God, but yet they have found God. This is because God himself has come to them to save them from the danger that they were in. And so on the surface, there are these two distinct groups that continue to be compared. Israel and the Gentiles. And from, again, understanding our illustration here, understanding the illustration that Paul is going to further elaborate on, we can look at these as two trees. Right? Two trees, offering two branches. And as we continue through the text, it will become apparent that the significance of the imagery that Paul uses is not wrapped up in the trees themselves. Again, we've spent at great length looking at the fact that it's works do not save. Works do not contribute. Works can't possibly ascend into heaven or descend to raise Christ up from the dead. No works, nothing. And so we see here that it's not about the trees themselves, but rather the one who tends to them. It's not about the trees themselves, but the one who tends to them. It's the one who handles both trees with care. His compassion for these trees is seen in his love despite the many flaws. At the heart of his compassion is an understanding of the goodness of the root. If branches are grafted into the tree, then they will receive an abundance of life. Apart from the tree, they're dead. They're dead. And seeing God's hands at work amongst both the Jews and the Gentiles, it's clear that there is a great kindness in his actions. While he allows for behaviors and actions to transpire, it comes forth from a heart that is seeking the good for all who are involved. You see, the reality is that God does allow certain actions, certain behaviors to transpire, but the text is going to reveal that these things take place under God's all-powerful vision. The truth I want you to see this morning is that the nuance of God's redemptive plan reveals to us his compassionate provision. The nuance of God's redemptive plan reveals to us his compassionate provision. You see, the idea of God's redemptive plan is progressive. Excuse me. We see throughout the Old Testament that there's these seeds of redemption that are planted, and they grow, and they grow, and they grow. But we see that ultimately there's a nuance to be had within this plan of redemption, that the way that it's setting forth to be accomplished isn't exactly how it's going to be accomplished, that God has a far greater plan involved. And so look back with me at the text as we see two thoughts to consider for why our faith and trust must grow in God in light of his compassionate provision. Look back with me starting the text in verse 1. I ask then, has God rejected his people? By no means. For I myself am an Israelite, a descendant of Abraham, a member of the tribe of Benjamin. God has not rejected his people whom he foreknew. Do you not know what the scriptures say of Elijah, how he appeals to God against Israel? Lord, they have killed your prophets, they have demolished your altars, and I alone am left, and they seek my life. But what is God's reply to him? I have kept for myself 7,000 men who have not bowed the knee to Baal. So too at the present time there is a remnant chosen by grace. But if it is by grace, it is no longer on the basis of works. Otherwise grace would no longer be grace. What then? Israel failed to obtain what it was seeking. The elect obtained it, but the rest were hardened, as it is written. God gave them a spirit of stupor, eyes that would not see, and ears that would not hear, down to this very day. And David says, let their table become a snare and a trap, a stumbling block and retribution for them. Let their eyes be darkened so that they cannot see and bend their backs forever. So the first thought to consider this morning is that despite the great failures of Israel, God's grace was still present. Despite the great failures of Israel, God's grace was still present. So Paul continues this letter in a Paul-like fashion by asking a hypothetical question. We see this time and time again. This is Paul's little mechanism in order to further establish his point. Paul asks the question, if all of this was true about Israel, did God reject his people? Did God reject his people? And again, in a Paul-like fashion, he answers with his famous catchphrase, by no means. And what is his testimony to this answer? Why can Paul answer in the affirmative that God didn't reject Israel? He says, myself, I'm the testimony, I'm the proof that God didn't reject his people. He goes on to acknowledge his ancestry comes from Abraham, that he is of the tribe of Benjamin, that he is an Israelite. And what is interesting here is that Paul uses this language of foreknowledge when talking about Israel, when talking about these people. Now, why this is interesting, because in the previous verses, when discussing the idea of the foreknowledge of God, he speaks to the reality that God knew all who would be saved, both Jew and Gentile. So the idea of foreknowledge has typically been associated with something even greater than, again, just the ethnic people of Israel. Right? It's been to identify that salvation was going to be extended to all people. But he's bringing back he's using this type of language normally in a holistic and inclusive way. And in doing so, he accomplishes the purpose again, that showing that true Israel was greater than just an ethnic people. But in using the language here, Paul is showing that the ethnic people of Israel also have a place in the true Israel. This is a truly tremendous revelation. You see, God's heart never grew cold against Israel. And that's such a wonderful thing for us to see this morning. As we go through the Old Testament, we consider what God has done. We see the promises made to Abraham that God was calling a people to himself, that he was creating a people. And as the timeline of Scripture unfolds, it is the people of Israel that are called. And so this tree springs forth with God as the root of its life. Now, the story that is found here is one of great care and compassion. You see, it is the story of a tree whose branches rejected the sustenance of the root. Again, this is what's being affirmed by Paul throughout. Israel rejected the righteousness of God. They rejected the life that was found in him. And this is the story that goes on and on and on. Whether it's coming out of Egypt and the complaining in the wilderness, to the needing the needing of judges because they're consistently wicked and they're being delivered to their enemies, to the rejection of God for an earthly kingdom. They didn't want a king like Yahweh. They wanted a king like everybody else. And so as it goes on, we see continued, time in, time out, only progressing, only growing stronger, that this tree continues to reject its root. But nonetheless, God still tends to the tree with loving care. It did not deter the perseverance of the one tending to it. Despite all the rejection, despite all the disobedience, God sought to still preserve Israel. In his great loving kindness, he accomplishes this, though many branches we see fall away. As we read the text, I want you to see this great compassion of God primarily seen in his provision of life. You see, for all intents and purposes, Israel deserved to be let go. I mean, if I am looking at Israel and all that they've done against God, and all of their rejection, and all of their defiance, I think that Israel deserved to be let go. I'm going to want to get rid of those branches and graft something good into its place. Because again, when we think about that imagery of grafting, you're taking strong things and bringing them together to make something even stronger, right? You're grafting them together. And so the reality is that when I'm looking at that root, the root of Yahweh, the great root, the perfect root, I don't necessarily believe that you want something so corrupt grafted to that, to be associated with that. And so from a truly just even almost logical perspective, it seems like they ought to be getting rid of. Those branches should be disposed of. But the language that is used of God preserving a remnant is telling. He does allow corruption to fall away. We're going to see even as the text goes on, he talks about those branches even being regrafted in. So they have to fall away first to be regrafted in. So he allows that. It is evident that God allows people to continue in disobedience. However, it wasn't God's desire that they do that. It wasn't God's desire that they do that. And that is what the text is showing us. There's a great reminder to us that God isn't so easily swayed by the branches of the tree. I know I can look at my own life and know that there are many times in which it was abundantly clear that God had every right to leave me on the ground, to be rid of me. He had every right to allow me to remain dead. It is this text, though, that testifies to the fact that God is a great God of compassion. He is a great God of compassion. Again, he beholds Israel in their corruption, in their dying, and yet he still seeks to preserve life in them. Again, despite it being time and time again, he seeks to, in his compassion, to preserve them, and he does. And he doesn't fail. He doesn't fail in his compassion. But we see that his compassion is great. And so I hope that this is a great encouragement to you today, as it is for me, because it testifies to the fact that God's compassion for his people doesn't cease. It doesn't cease, and it doesn't fail. You know, I don't know the circumstances that you face this morning, but as you face them, as you face trials of various kinds, I want you to see the great compassion of God that he has set upon you. Look back with me at our text starting in verse 11. So I ask, did they stumble in order that they might fall? By no means. Rather, through their trespass, salvation has come to the Gentiles, so as to make Israel jealous. Now, if their trespass means riches for the world, and if their failure means riches for the Gentiles, how much more will their full inclusion mean? Now, I'm speaking to you Gentiles, and inasmuch then as I am an apostle to the Gentiles, I magnify my ministry in order to somehow make my fellow Jews jealous and thus save some of them. For if their rejection means the reconciliation of the world, what will their acceptance mean but life from dead? If the dough offered as first fruits is holy, so is the whole lump. And if the root is holy, so are the branches. But if some of the branches were broken off, and you, although a wild olive shoot, were grafted in among the others, and now share in the nourishing root of the olive tree, do not be arrogant toward the branches. If you are, remember, it is not you who support the root, but the root that supports you. Then you will say, branches were broken off so that I might be grafted in. That is true. They were broken off because of their unbelief. But you stand fast through faith. So do not become proud, but fear. For if God did not spare the natural branches, neither will he spare you. Note then the kindness and the severity of God. Severity towards those who have fallen, but God's kindness to you, provided you continue in his kindness. Otherwise you too will be cut off. And even they, if they do not continue in their unbelief, will be grafted in, for God has the power to graft them in again. For if you were cut off from what is by nature a wild olive tree, and grafted, contrary to nature, into a cultivated olive tree, how much more will these, the natural branches, be grafted back in to their own olive tree? And so the second thought for us to consider this morning is this, that God's grafting of the Gentiles shows his great kindness and compassion for the lost. Paul continues the letter by asking another hypothetical question. He asks the question, did they stumble as to fall? And again, in Paul-like fashion, he responds with a little catchphrase. He says, may it never be. May it never be. Again, what transpires in Israel is not a surprise to God. And again, actually within all of this, again, within the nuance of his redemptive plan, again, it wasn't that simple. It wasn't a matter of, I'm going to call this one specific people, I'm going to bring a Messiah to redeem them, and then that same specific people only are going to be saved. But rather what we see here is the unfolding of the nuance of God's redemptive work. Again, nothing that is happening is a surprise to God. Paul states that by the transgression of Israel, salvation has come to the Gentiles in order to make Israel jealous. And so even from this point, we can see the nuances of God's redemptive plan. We see that God allowed Israel to act in a rebellious manner. Again, he allows this behavior to take place so that he could show great compassion to the lost. In doing this, what is even greater is that while showing compassion to the lost Gentiles, and so again, he's set forth to fulfill his promises of making a great nation, right? This is the promise he's made to Abraham. I will make you a great people. But as the people of Israel reject the root, God extends the redemptive work to all nations, to bless all nations. And in doing so, he is making a great nation. However, even in doing that, he is calling these Gentiles to salvation. Paul states that he's trying to make Israel jealous. And so, he's affording an opportunity in a dynamic fashion to show his compassion to Israel even more. Again, his heart has not grown cold. Even in their failures, he's going about drawing them to himself in a new, kind of nuanced way. He isn't going particularly now just to woo them. We look at the Old Testament, and we look at Hosea, and he talks about how he is wooing Israel to himself. You know, this very straightforward and tender way of calling Israel. But now, because that didn't work, because of, again, Israel's rejection and their sin, he's going about it in another way. And he's using the motive of jealousy. That now the people of God extend beyond the Jews, and now it catches their attention. Now they're looking to God. Now they see him. So again, we see that God's compassion is dynamic. He seeks to extend it in various different ways that we wouldn't anticipate. And that's why even when I look at the circumstances of our lives, and we wouldn't choose certain paths for ourselves, we wouldn't choose certain things to happen, we can trust and believe when we look at even the dynamics of the gospel and the nuances of the gospel, that God is able to work out good and show compassion even in unlikely ways. All of this only further emphasizes how compassionate the providence of God is in this world. Now, I love in the midst of this teaching, Paul gives a subtle call to humility. Because the reality is that there's all this talk of, and he just knows fleshly hearts. He knows the fleshly hearts of his audience. You know, he's pulling these branches in and these branches in, and he's choosing them, and he foreknew them, and, okay, well, God chose me. He chose me to graft in, and he sees here that ultimately that this can lead to a pride point. And remember, he's writing to an audience of both Jews and Gentiles. And so he understands really pragmatically that real division is taking place over this. And so he's reminding us that as we look to the work of God in our lives, that we ought to, again, behold it purely as the compassion and goodness of God and not anything that we are contributing. Because again, Paul has made it clear from the very first chapter that both Jews and Gentiles are dead in their transgressions because of their rejection of God. And so Paul wants us to remember that reflecting on this great compassion of God and his gracious deeds must lead us to a humble way of life. The reality is that we ought to be in awe of God's passionate provision to us. That's why even when we look at these passages and we're talking about the gospel, and even these particular past weeks, it's really focused on the gospel, a message that I think so many of us have become very, very comfortable with. I think what Paul's trying to show us here is don't become just comfortable with it. Don't let it become just standard fare. The fact that you were grafted into the tree with the root of life, and you were dead. You were a dead stick on the ground, and that God did that for you, should really move us to be awe-inspired by what God is doing and what he has done for us. And that leads us to live a certain way with one another and with the world around us. I mean, when that sense of awe is in the forefront, that really protects us from faulty ways of living and faulty ways of thinking. And so let us be filled with the awe of God's great compassion and his provision to us. Now, when we think back to the idea of grafting trees together, it's worth noting that the two that are being grafted together should be of the same kind. If not, the grafting will not be successful. What is so remarkable about the work of God and his redemptive plan is that he makes the grafting possible. He makes the grafting possible. You see, the root of the tree is righteous and holy. It is unique in its character. It's unique in its kind. It's perfect, perfectly righteous, perfectly holy. And the branches, they lie dead on the ground. And they don't bear that same quality. However, by the work of God, through Christ Jesus, the branches are brought to life, and then through Christ are given the common substance of righteousness, that they might graft together. It is the work of God only that makes this grafting possible. This is why Paul says that even those branches that have fallen off from Israel, the ones that rejected him, that rejected God, and fell from the tree that had sprung forth from him, he says even them, the grafting for them is possible. If they don't continue in their unbelief, they can be grafted in. They will be grafted in because, what does Paul say? For he is able to. He is able to. I mean, really the picture, and again, we have to try to step into this context because, again, this idea of grafting plants and trees together is not common for all of us on a day-to-day basis. And so when we look at what this imagery is supposed to show, it's really showing us just kind of the impossible nature of the work that God has accomplished, but it is because it's only a work that he can. He is the only one who is able to do that. And so this is a powerful reminder that the grace and compassion of God extends to all people. There isn't a person on the face of this earth that is beyond the saving grace of God. There are a lot of people out there who've done some pretty awful things. But this text reveals to us that because it is the power of God that brings people into the family of God, that he is able to even redeem and reconcile the worst. And that's what Paul says. He is the worst. He's the chief of sinners. And yet God not only reconciled them, but he called them to a great purpose for the sake of the gospel. And I know when we talk about people doing bad things, awful things, certain people might come to your mind, and it can be a natural response to not want them to receive that, right? Sometimes when we think of someone who's just truly awful and truly bad, sometimes the natural response is, Lord, allow them just to continue and to meet that just fate that they have in store for them. However, when we understand what is at work, when we see God's glory on display as he grafts the worst branches to the tree and provides them life, and provides them substance. And he gives them of the righteousness that they might identify with him. We see God's glory on display as he provides life and transformation. And that reality is the good news of the gospel, that each of us, no matter the extent of our sin in our past, has found free grace in Jesus Christ. It's transformative. It leads us into a holy way of living, but you didn't earn it. We didn't work for it. We couldn't. And so we have received that free grace of Jesus. It was God who did the work. It was God who redeemed us. It was God who grafted us in. And so as we look at texts like these and see God's great redemptive plan extends far and wide, I pray that we would find great joy in knowing the depths of his compassion. And so, I'm sure many of us are aware that God loves us. If we've put our faith in Jesus Christ and we've understood the gospel, I'm sure this is relatively clear. However, I hope that as you have seen the depths and the angles, the nuances of God's compassion for calling and preserving of a people, that you would grow in your faith and trust in him. That those would take greater root in him. In seeing this, we open our hearts to a great confidence in him. So church, as you leave here this morning, find great joy in God's unfailing compassion for you.